It was a royal wedding weekend and Britain was enjoying a public holiday. At their home in the English Midlands, a Chinese family, the Dings, joined in the celebrations. They had made Britain their home.
They opened a Chinese medicine shop and they had 3 shops across the UK, and that was quite successful, and that represented that we're doing well financially and that they were quite proud of their businesses.
The Dings had set up a partnership with another Chinese family.
Anxiang and his wife came to this country from China in 1998. They were both doctors of traditional Chinese medicine, and they started a family, and after a short while they met the Dings. She was a businesswoman and he was a lecturer at university in Manchester.
But all was not what it seemed between the couples. The picture-perfect Ding family were about to be killed, one by one. The eldest daughter desperately phoning police for help as her assassin walked towards her.
It was the kind of thing that just makes your blood run cold in your veins. You know, it's that thing where you forget to breathe, where you are chilled throughout your whole body, and you just think, I'm witnessing somebody die a violent death. There's nothing to describe the horror when you know what those screams represent and what those poor children were going through.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Anxiang as guilty of murder? What would be a killer's mistake?
Nobody should die that way.
I've never seen anything that horrific.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
Make sure to like and subscribe.
The scene, which met officers as they arrived at the home of the Ding family in a quiet English village, was horrific.
My reaction was incredulity, because not so much in the sense that 2 adults had been murdered. I mean, sadly, you know, we all know that happens. I think the ferocity of the attack, the fact that it was a knife-related killing with multiple stab wounds, blood everywhere. But I think the thing that tipped it over the edge for me was the slaying of the 2 girls in the upstairs bedroom. To go and kill 2 defenceless girls cowering in their bedroom in their own home beggars belief.
Xing and Alice Ding, both talented violinists, quite literally knew what was coming. Their attacker had begun with their father.
He confronts Jeff Ding, produces his knife and attacks him. Jeff Ding tries to fight off the attack, to ward off the stab wounds, sustains defence wounds to his hands, and Jeff Ding dies of these stab wounds.
The attack was in the kitchen of the house. Jeff Ding's killer had only just begun.
It's believed that Helen Ding hears the commotion in the kitchen and she comes in and immediately attacks her. She has no defence wounds, she hasn't had time to shield herself from the blows, but she's stabbed 13 times down the left side of her body. Fatal blows. He's killed them both, but he's not finished. He then turns his attention to their 2 daughters.
One 18, one just 12, and mercilessly and brutally, in front of each other, stabbed them to death.
Before she died, the oldest Ding daughter managed to use her mobile phone to call the police.
It came to light that there was a telephone call that was made, horrifically enough, from one of the girls who had a mobile phone. So they tried to ring the police, And it went through on the 999 system, but it's what they call a dropped call. So when the emergency operator received the call, they just heard some screams on the end of the phone, and then the call dropped because it ended.
Events elsewhere had an influence on the possibilities of why the call had been made.
It was bank holiday afternoon, so I think there was an element that people thought it was some kind of prank or holiday high spirits. Nevertheless, the police were sent to the location that was indicated from mobile phone tracking that goes with a 999 call, but unfortunately, because of the nature of that tracking, the police were sent to the wrong location. So we know from that phone call, which was received at about just after 3:30 in the afternoon, that was when the murders were taking place, somewhere around the 3:30 mark. But the girls never got to make their request for assistance.
Phone tracking is not an exact science.
So it took the officers to a location at least a mile distant from where the actual murders had occurred. And of course, having turned up and there's nothing here and there doesn't appear to be any problem, would probably, add to this idea that, it's just a prank call. Sadly, the 999 service, fire, ambulance and police do get prank calls. This, chillingly, was not. This was a real call, and those were probably the last human sounds that those two poor girls made.
There can be little doubt that the Ding family will have screamed. But neighbours heard nothing. Their home overlooked a landscaped area free from other properties. It's probable that within minutes of Anxiang arriving at the house in Pioneer Close, all four had been killed.
The daughters were found upstairs in their bedrooms. One of the daughters was curled up in a ball. You get stabbed repeatedly, especially in the stomach. It's extremely painful, so maybe she was curled up in a ball because she was in so much pain and she then lost consciousness in that position. Another of the daughters was found in a prayer position.
With all four dead, the killer had completed what appeared to be a mission, wiping out an entire family.
What we now know that he did was that, having murdered the family in cold blood, he washed the murder weapon and knife and his hands and left it at the sink. I think the court records will say that he then felt some kind of physical reaction to having committed the murders and actually slept for a while at the house where the murders had been committed.
The slaying of the Ding family was over by 3:30 on the afternoon of Friday, April 29th. 42 hours would pass before their slaughter would be uncovered. Time enough for their killer to be a long way from the scene of their murder. Detectives know that most murders are carried out by someone who knows the victim well. Suspecting someone is, however, a far cry from having the evidence to prove a case. Seasoned investigators tend towards routine when trying to first find and then see a killer convicted. That routine generally starts with getting a phone call. The man who would lead the hunt for the killer of the Ding family is Glyn Timmins. He too was enjoying the royal wedding bank holiday when he heard of their death.
On the night of the 1st of May, when the murders came to light, my colleague was the on-call senior investigating officer for Northamptonshire, and he'd been sent to the discovery of bodies at a house in the Wootton area of Northamptonshire. And because they appeared to be the bodies of 4 family members within their family home, as the senior detective for Northamptonshire, I was put on alert to go and oversee the inquiry.
The family were murdered at their home on Friday, the 29th of April last year. The bodies weren't discovered till late Sunday afternoon, early Sunday evening, on the 1st of May.
One step at a time, evidence is gathered. Amongst the first pieces of the picture of a killer to emerge as Timmins and his team began their investigation, the time of death. Friday afternoon. Science provided that information.
When you die, after about 2 hours, between 2 and 4 hours, you get this kind of stiffening of the muscles. It starts off in the face and the neck and these little muscles, and then it spreads to these bigger muscles. And what's happening is a kind of chemical process in the muscle fibres where they're becoming cross-linked and stiff and rigid. That rigor mortis, that stiffness, will be maintained for about 2 days, after which the muscle fibres begin to disintegrate and then they become floppy again. So you can use the stiffness of different parts of the body to get some sort of estimation of how much time has elapsed.
Establishing time of death was a straightforward enough conclusion for pathologists. For detectives, a range of theories now had to be considered. One immediately occurred to the lead investigator.
Your first reaction is, well, do we have a murder or do we have some kind of murder-suicide, which does happen from time to time.
This, however, was not a case of murder-suicide. That was a theory soon dismissed. For it to be the case, the body of one of the 4 dead would offer no signs of having struggled.
I think we reached that conclusion fairly quickly because of the positions that the victims were found in, and it was clear that there had been a very violent struggle, and both the adult victims had been murdered as opposed to having a struggle between themselves. So it was clear fairly quickly that we were dealing with a third-party murderer.
What about the nationality and culture of the victims? Investigators would learn that revenge, always a possible motive in any murder inquiry, is one which has a long history in Chinese society, where loss of face has been known to lead to vendettas against whole families. Was that what was behind the killer's actions? Was he taking revenge on an entire family for having lost face over something?
In Chinese culture, there is a point where, I need to seek revenge in some way because he's done that to me. Ding has done that to me, therefore I need to sort of challenge that. I want him to lose face as well. He needs to do something about this family.
Sunday, May 1st, 2011 fell into 2 phases for the police. Before the discovery of the bodies, police in Northampton hear of an alert issued to all forces for a missing person, a Chinese national called Anxiang Du. Du was the co-owner of this herbal medicine business in Birmingham, and he had not been heard from since calling into the store on the public holiday 2 days earlier.
We went into the shopping centre and left in the appointments book there a note to his family in Mandarin Chinese, which said things like eternal blessings and were clearly kind of phrases that thought he was not going to see them again.
He left a message for his wife, basically telling her, goodbye, I'm going. What he didn't really realise was that his wife would then contact the police to report him missing.
It was on the Saturday, the 30th, she'd gone to the shop that they owned in Birmingham and found what appeared to be a suicide note. In actual fact, when you read the note, it read more as a goodbye note than potentially a suicide note. But as it was, that's how the note was interpreted. And as such, Anxiang Du was circulated by West Midlands Police quite rightly as a vulnerable missing person.
An alert goes to his local police force in the West Midlands saying this man has gone missing, he's in an agitated state, we're worried about him. That missing persons alert in the West Midlands will go centrally, so the police in Northampton who are coming across this slaughtered family will also have that information that a man, a Chinese national, has gone missing and is in an agitated state.
A trawl of people who might know Anxiang Du turned up the name of Jeff Ding.
It is quite common for the police to visit known associates of the missing person, and the Ding family were one of the few known associates of Anxiang Du.
So that Sunday morning of May 1st, an officer was sent to the Ding family home in an effort to find out if Mr. Du had been in touch with them.
The police were called that morning to visit the Ding family to see if they'd seen Du, and of course they knocked the door, got no reply early on a Sunday morning, nothing unusual in that, and left a calling card for them to contact the police. Obviously the officers, there is no way they could have known what was inside that quiet suburban house on a quiet, nice estate in a nice part of Northamptonshire.
Outside the house, no car. It was possible they were away. So, with their bodies inside, the officers attending the scene, oblivious to what had happened, left.
It is incredible, and I mean, you know, there are occasions when this inquiry for me was marked more by extraordinary coincidences, missed opportunities, frustrations, barriers, than it was to, you know, normal detective work. I mean, it was literally a case of one step forward, two steps back.
Phase 2 of how police viewed events of May 1st, 2011 followed the eventual discovery of the bodies.
A neighbour of the Dings realises she hasn't seen the family about for a day, goes over and peers through the windows of their house and sees the carnage inside.
After the discovery of the bodies and the arrival of murder squad detectives on the case, it seemed too much of a coincidence. A Chinese family slaughtered on the day that a Chinese national who knew them is reported missing. The Dings had owned a Chinese herbal medicine business. Another Chinese national who owned a herbal medicine business was now officially a missing person. Why had the police in Birmingham assumed that the Dings would know anything about Anxiang Du? It turned out that Anxiang Du felt that he had plenty to be resentful about towards Jeff Ding. It wasn't always the case. The Ding and Du families went back a long time after the two women introduced their husbands to each other.
What we know is that Kan Cheng Du and Ji Shui Ding became friends, and as they were becoming friends, their husbands, obviously, they met each other.
Initially they were friends and they went into business together to run a herbal medicine company.
And they in fact opened 3 of these shops, and things were looking good for them.
The then young professionals shared an expertise and worked hard.
And that was quite successful, and that represented that we're doing well financially and that they were quite proud of their businesses. That honour to them was quite what they represented. They can provide for their families, they can enjoy their lifestyle a bit more, because coming from mainland China, I'm sure they would have had quite hardships trying to find jobs, you know, trying to provide for themselves. So when they came over to Britain, this was an opportunity for success, you know, to be able to give their families the lifestyle that they probably didn't have when they were children.
However, disputes soon emerged between the business partners.
That relationship went sour when Anxiang Du was asked to leave the business by the Dings because of allegations of financial irregularity.
There were no charges, no police involvement, but it was the first hint that something was going wrong. And then 3 years later, in 2004, the Dus were dismissed from the partnership.
Things were to turn ugly. A complex dispute ended up in court.
Du and his wife started legal proceedings against the Dings on the basis they thought they'd been unfairly thrown out of their business partnership.
With the court procedures, at the start, they were quite in favour of the Dus, but as time progressed, the ruling was in favour of the Dings, and that meant for Du it was really spiralling out of control, and there was no hope really for him to go anywhere, to start a business, or, you know, just to find the financial means to support his family.
And at the end of that battle, it was the Dings and not the Dus that succeeded.
The feud which had developed between the two families caused Anxiang Du's bitterness to run deep. He now faced paying £88,000 in legal fees. A complex financial arrangement meant that the house the Dings were now living in was part of the business's assets. Du hoped to sell the house in the village of Wootton, Northamptonshire. It would help him pay off his legal costs. But Du did not actually own it. A court order was issued, preventing Du from trying to sell the house.
Effectively, it froze the assets until the court made its determination, but effectively it meant that Mr. Du had no access to his financial assets, and the sale of his house was prevented.
That order was issued the day before the murders. Detectives had their motive.
Who would want to kill these people? Why would they be killed like this? And because of the legal case and because of the bitterness and the rancour that was around the splitting up of their business, Du would be the obvious suspect.
I mean, clearly the delivery of the court restraining orders the night before had effectively pushed him over the edge in terms of anger, rage, the need to hit back. And I suspect that he spent most of that night thinking about it, ruminating about it, building it up in terms of bile, anger, the need for revenge and retribution. And by the time he went to work on that Friday morning, I'm as convinced as I can be that he had murder in mind, that was his objective.
In any culture, what had happened to Anxiang Du would cause deep resentment. Some commentators on Chinese culture suggest a violent reaction was all but inevitable.
On one side, you've got the financial difficulties because now he's trying to find another job.
Du had lost this court case. He was in a huge amount of debt.
But more importantly is the loss of face. Obviously, because it's all about pride and how one holds themselves in the Chinese culture. When something turns as sour as that, it's almost as if your whole world has turned upside down.
There was, to Anxiang Du, a lot to be angry about. 2 motive boxes were ticked.
There are a couple of things that come up in murder cases as common motives. One of them is, a big one, is revenge. So, he wanted revenge. It's something like 3% of homicide cases in this country have a financial motive. 40% of them, the motive is it's either an argument or a struggle or it's a revenge attack.
We very quickly were able to examine the background of the association between the Ding family and Anxiang Du and establish this court battle that had been ongoing. So very, very quickly we were able to pinpoint Du as the likely murder suspect.
Displaying a motive to kill so obviously had betrayed Du as the prime suspect. Police quickly put out appeals for information.
Extensive forensic examination of the scene took place late Sunday and into Monday, the 2nd of May, all day Monday the 2nd of May. This led to us naming Anxiang Du as the prime suspect in this case on Tuesday, the 3rd of May.
The court case which had so enraged Anxiang Du involved a third party, someone who had become involved in the business. Was he now at risk?
We didn't know where this murderer had gone, clearly wasn't still at the scene. And obviously your determination at the outset of any homicide inquiry is to bring the offender to justice, but this was clearly something completely out of the ordinary, if I can use such a term for homicide.
Where was Anxiang Du? What mistake had he made to lead police to him and to prove he was a killer? And would he kill again? Within hours of the discovery of the murdered Ding family, police begin a painstaking trawl through digital evidence. They needed to find him, but also to build a case, and they would uncover plenty of sightings.
The UK is one of the most highly watched places in the world. There's vast numbers of CCTV cameras which have been put up by the police, by local authorities, by private businesses, and increasingly private individuals are installing CCTV cameras. So there's estimated to be more than, I think, somewhere between 4 and 6 million CCTV cameras in the UK.
Police were able to watch step by step Du's activities before the slaughter at Pioneer Close. His mistakes began the moment that he left his home on the day of the murders.
He hadn't really thought through the possibilities as to how he might be caught, because he didn't really take any precautions.
The timeline of movement for Anxiang began on the Friday at about 10 o'clock-ish. He drove to Coventry Railway Station.
From Coventry, he bought a ticket to get him to his shop in Birmingham. Cameras gathering information every second. He headed to his store, Natural Care in Birmingham.
It appears that he wasn't in the shop for very long, that he gathered a rucksack and wrote this goodbye note to his wife.
He picks up a bag which contains a knife.
It was the murder weapon.
And within a matter of minutes, left the shop, went to Birmingham New Street and started that fateful journey via train to Northampton, transferring at Northampton to the bus station.
Again, he was captured on camera. The journey from Birmingham to Northampton ended at 12:37. There, he soon found a bus that would take him to Wootton, the village where the Dings lived. On the bus, he appeared perfectly normal to other passengers, just someone else on a bus ride. During the journey, he changed seats. As he alighted, an issue to overcome. He was in the right village, but where was the house?
He doesn't know the area, he gets lost, he asks for directions to a driver, he's given directions but they're wrong as well. So there's quite a bit of toing and froing.
He would arrive at the house around 3 o'clock. The fate of the Ding family was sealed.
The last thing that he expects is his former business partner, is coming uninvited to his house, intent on revenge. But that's what happens. Anxiang comes into the kitchen.
Later, Anxiang would claim he was met with more provocation.
Ding laughed at Du and called him a fool. That is almost like public shaming. It is, one of the worst things that you can probably do in Chinese culture, because you're shaming them in front of everyone.
He confronts Jeff Ding, produces his knife and attacks him.
Mrs. Ding seems to have been attacked just outside of the kitchen.
Du turns his attention onto her, again stabs her multiple times.
And then he ran upstairs to attack the daughters, who were cowering in a bedroom.
Anxiang went upstairs in that house, found two young girls cowering on a bed.
They're trying to summon help. But Du goes upstairs, finds them, and attacks them both. Stabs them both again, multiple times, again concentrating on the area of the body where he knows the vital organs are, intending to kill them. And he does. He kills both the girls. So within a matter of minutes, he's slain the entire family, mother, father, and both daughters.
The parents' bodies were found hidden behind a curtain downstairs, so they'd obviously been moved. The daughters were found upstairs in their bedrooms. One of the daughters was curled up in a ball.
Du's mind, previously entirely dominated by a lust to kill, now turned to covering his tracks.
Du's quite calm and collected.
Having murdered the family in cold blood, he washed the murder weapon and knife and his hands and left it at the sink.
Having first slept after the murders, Du now plots his escape.
What he found was Jeff Ding's wallet and car keys, and decided, well, that's the means by which I'm going to make my escape.
The Ding car, one they had hired, was conspicuous by its absence when a police officer had visited. It was not there because Anxiang had taken it. It seems likely he waited until dark and left Pioneer Close sometime after 8:30 on April 29th. He then headed for a motorway.
The last sighting was at junction 8A of the M40, which is some miles distant of London, so he could have gone pretty much anywhere on that motorway. We were reliant on finding the stolen Vauxhall Corsa.
Du's escape was haphazard but successful. He heads south and gets lucky as he drives into London by using a route where there were no cameras capable of automatic number plate recognition. He went undetected, for now.
The car was abandoned in a side street, this Venables street, and we've got grainy CCTV at about 2:30 in the morning of someone matching Anxiang Du's description, walking along and looking into a shop front as he leaves the car behind.
The illegally parked car gets ticketed again and again and again over 9 days. Du once again got lucky. There is a nationwide hunt for him and for the car that he was driving, but none of the traffic wardens called the vehicle in to be towed away. If they had, it would have alerted police to its whereabouts and given them hope of finding Du.
Incredibly, perhaps, the car is parked in London and tracks 9 parking tickets, but nobody manages to connect the fact that this car is the one that was being used by the wanted man.
This case highlights a flaw in the system. You'd expect that if a car has been parked on a stretch of road and amassed 9 parking tickets over a series of days, that might flag up something to the local authority, that there may be a problem with this car, maybe it's been stolen and abandoned, maybe something has happened to the owner, because otherwise how come they haven't come back and moved their car to stop them getting more parking tickets? That red flag wasn't raised, and maybe if it had, they might have got more information sooner.
The apparent abandon shown by Anxiang meant that the police were getting reports from people who'd seen him on public transport.
We have had over 380 suspect sightings. The majority of those sightings have been in the UK, and all of those sightings are dealt with under a very strict process to make sure we get the optimum from those sightings.
In fact, Anxiang had got lucky for a 3rd time. He boards a ferry for France and is again not spotted.
So he makes that journey across to France, he makes his way down through France, into Spain, and eventually gets the ferry from Algeciras across to Tangiers.
Anxiang goes off grid in Morocco. He's living there under a false name, getting what work he can.
His luck just keeps on coming.
Once he's in Morocco, Du's actually arrested. He's arrested on suspicion of being there illegally. And he's released. This is only 5 days after the murders. But he's released because he claims his name is Li Ming, that he's from Taiwan, and he's allowed to stay. And he goes on to get a job. He ends up working as a night watchman on a construction site, and he had nowhere to live. He was sleeping sort of rough in the construction site, and some of the other workers kind of took pity on him and would give him food and so forth because they thought his life was so poor. But he was still free. He'd managed to escape.
Du had made a series of mistakes as he had set off to murder his victims. The trail of evidence from his front door to the house where he had killed, together with the clear motive that he had, was likely to get police a conviction. But within weeks of the murders, he was 2,000 miles away, living almost rough, with a new name, a new job, a new life. Police, meanwhile, were ramping up their appeals for help.
The Ding family had been in the UK since about late 1990. Jeff was working at Manchester University as a lecturer. Helen working locally at a school in Northampton, and with the children involved in education in Northampton as well. Since around 2002, both Jeff and Helen had been involved in a civil dispute with the Chinese family over a business issue.
They knew who they were looking for and why he had killed. What would be the mistake to ensure that the police would catch a killer? Detecting who had killed the Ding family had not taken long. Anxiang had hardly tried to cover his tracks.
I think by then, my personal opinion is that he set his mind on a course of action and he was blind to everything else.
In the months which followed the murders, police knew they would need all the help they could get, and they travelled far and wide.
Our visit to China had three specific aims. These were to brief the Ministry of Public Security, which are essentially the Chinese police in Beijing, and inform them of the inquiry, the work we've undertaken today, and also to seek their assistance for further inquiries.
Unbeknownst to police, Du's haphazard escape plan had worked. But he was not in China, he was in North Africa, free but facing the indignity of sleeping on a construction site, living on handouts.
I think Du would have found that humiliating, you know, on a makeshift bed and having food parcels, because he's so used to having his business, being able to provide for his family, and his lifestyle has drastically changed, you know, being able to provide for his family, having the means to go out and socialise with people, and for him to be isolated in Morocco, for him to have almost the food parcels given to him and sleeping on the makeshift bed, that's such a different lifestyle for Du that he's just not used to.
He cut an unmistakable figure, and it was this which was to be his undoing. His image had been captured by cameras throughout the English Midlands. It had taken time, but his getaway car had been found in London. It was hard to miss the face of Anxiang Du.
Anxiang Du becomes the most wanted person on the Crime Stoppers website. He's, you know, it's imperative for the police to find him as soon as possible. This is a man who's killed 4 people already, and there's a danger there. He circulates internationally because it's feared that he might have gone abroad.
I have to accept that Anxiang Du may have left the UK. We still look for him within the UK, but he may have left the UK possibly soon after the murders. Someone must have assisted him and is likely to be still assisting him or aware of where he is. I emphasise we've now increased the reward to £25,000, which is a substantial award, and we're looking for that information to come to us directly as the investigation team or through Crime Stoppers.
And that was how Du would be caught. As sightings stopped, it became clear that he'd got out of Britain. His profile, so easy to publicise using the images captured on surveillance, made for headline news and international Crime Stopper programmes.
I should also stress that today we've had no confirmed sightings of Anxiang Du anywhere in the world. This is one reason why I've fully utilised the Crime Stoppers structure, for example, throughout the UK, Europe and lately North America, to highlight to as wide an audience as possible.
The availability of Du's image made it easier to spread the word.
What he doesn't realise is that Spanish TV has a programme quite similar to Crime Watch in the UK, and they cover the case, and his photo is put onto Spanish TV, and then someone recognises him in Morocco.
In July 2012, so some 14 months after the murders, the man who runs the building site and employs him as night watchman realises that his night watchman is actually Anxiang Du, the wanted quadruple murderer from the UK. He tells the police. Du is arrested in Morocco when he is finally brought back to the UK and charged with the murder of the 4 members of the Ding family.
Killers who are captured have always made at least one mistake. Du was first reported to police by his own wife, anxious at seeing a note showing Du in despair. Was that his biggest mistake?
The letter was obviously the precursor to Anxiang Du being treated as what we call a vulnerable missing person. What that did was elevate his status as a missing person to one of a high priority. So the very fact that he was identified as potentially being vulnerable through what appeared to be a suicide threat meant that the police would make immediate active enquiries to trace his whereabouts. And it was those immediate active enquiries to trace his whereabouts that provided the vital link between our murders and the missing person inquiry.
Or was the killer's mistake the trail that he left, which made it easy for detectives to know who the killer was.
I think Du's biggest mistake was not realising the extent of surveillance in this country. Once you become a person of interest, the police can then go back and look at the CCTV footage, and they can find images of you everywhere. There were images of him travelling by train, there were images of him on a bus towards the victim's house. Then once he steals their car, there's the automatic number plate recognition cameras that are picking up where that vehicle is travelling.
Virtually everything he did on the day of the murders and the day after were recorded, and police were able to go back to and piece together his entire route.
Once you become a person of interest, you are watched and there are photos of you everywhere, and it was really those photos and those images which helped convict him.
For lead detective Glyn Timmins, the context of Anxiang Du's murders make him amongst the worst killers that he has come across.
When you talk about evil, you talk about pre-planning, you talk about those elements that somebody has deigned that you were going to die. I don't think it was evil from that point of view, because this was blind rage.
Why had he done it? His argument had been with Jeff Ding and his wife. But surely not the children.
You might wonder why Du killed the whole of the Ding's family and not just Ding himself.
What was more important to him was getting the revenge that he felt was due for the wrong that had been done to him and to his family.
And it's really because the way that the Chinese culture works. We talked about losing faith in the family name, and for Du, Ding has taken everything away from him. Therefore, Du not only has to kill Ding, but he has to kill everyone associated with the Ding name. So that includes his wife and the 2 children.
Not something a hard-nosed detective finds easy to take.
Nothing will ever reconcile me to the mentality of somebody who goes up to a child's bedroom, finds 2 innocent young people cowering on a bed, having slain their parents. They're in terror, and then that person goes setting about them with a knife, stabbing them repeatedly in front of each other to take their lives. That is malevolent, that is evil. There is no way that I can ever come to terms with that. It just defies every belief I hold dear. It's inconceivable.
In 2013, Anxiang Du argued in court that he was guilty only of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He had lost control. His defence was rejected by a jury, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 40 years behind bars. He will be 94 when he is eligible for release. A young woman with a troubled background suddenly controls $1 million property in New Hampshire. How? She had found a way of tempting the old man who'd owned the farm.
She bared her breasts. She exposed herself, sent photos of herself in very sensual positions, and she got a response. And that's how she ended up in her relationship with this man who eventually dies, and as a result of his death, now she has this house.
Soon after, young, vulnerable men down on their luck are seen coming and going. Neighbours fear that the farm is harbouring a grim secret.
Coming down the wooden path, they saw a man stumbling and bleeding from the head. It was Michael Deloge, and he just said one word: Sheila.
Another young man, Kenny County, was hooked on the older woman who had taken him in. His mother appealed for him to come home.
You don't want to be with a 47-year-old. There's ulterior motives there. No. And Kenny said, no, she loves me.
Kenny County would become the second man killed at the hands of Sheila Labar. Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Sheila Labar as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? On a farm just outside Epping in New Hampshire, detectives answering a call related to the disappearance of this man come across a grisly sight.
So they went over and took a look inside. And what they found in there was a human bone. And on the knob of the bone was some human flesh. So now they are very worried about what has happened to Kenneth County.
Weeks earlier, Kenny's mother was convinced that her son had suffered harm at the hands of a woman called Sheila LaBar. She feared he was possibly dead. She wanted a detective, a man called Cody, to check that Sheila LaBar had not killed Kenny.
Detective Cody said no, there was no reason to. And I said, is she going to kill my son? Because at that point, and that was in the very beginning, at that point, I knew something wasn't right. And he said, no, she's known to the Epping police and she would never do that.
Who was Sheila LaBar? What had happened to Kenny County? Why was there a human bone on a bonfire? Questions which would gradually be answered as police tried to uncover a killer's mistake. First, they had to find out about the characters in what appeared a disturbing and bizarre story. Sheila LaBar had been known as Sheila Bailey during an unsettled childhood.
Sheila was born in a very small town in Alabama named Fort Payne. Sheila's childhood was very troubled. Her older sister says that Sheila was the subject of sexual abuse from her father and from other men.
Kenny County had a troubled childhood too. When little more than a baby, his mother noticed he was behind others in his age range.
Kenny started having delayment in his academics. I brought him to the hospital. I brought him back and forth to the hospital to make sure that there was nothing wrong. At the time, he was 1.5. I noticed that he started doing some clicking noises in front of the TV. He was taking petite seizures. So I brought him to the Children's Hospital, and they did a CAT scan, and they did an MRI, and they found out that the left side of the brain never grew. And so that, added to Kenny's problems.
As he grew older, Kenny always appeared timid. Despite a tough start and his learning difficulties, he appeared to many to be a standard young man. Likeable too.
Kenny was a very trusting guy, but he was looking for his way in the world. He had a very loving family. His mother really took care of him. She understood that things were more difficult for Kenny than they were for other people.
Sheila LaBar, born 20 years before Kenny, had suffered even before puberty. She had been sexualized by abusive men.
She grew up in a very abusive environment, was displayed as a sexual toy, was passed around to older grown men, friends of her father's, as a sexual object.
Sheila's father was often drunk and frequently violent. Her mother, Ruby, did what she could to protect her daughters, but it wasn't enough.
A teenage Sheila Bailey longed to escape this violent, small-town life. She dreamed of becoming an artist, a model, perhaps a singer, but in the end, she chose an easier route to financial independence. She found herself a man. But the abused woman would become a negligent stepmother.
Sheila was very young at the time. She was about, I think, 18 or 19 years old when she married John. He was a lineman for the county, and he was recently divorced and had a young daughter named Wendy.
Already, she was showing signs of being a disturbed, damaged individual.
Sheila was not the most maternal person. Wendy told her father that when he would go to work, Sheila would take care of her by making her drink something. Brandy, maybe it's cough syrup, something that made her feel very sleepy. And it was also then that Sheila would put Wendy in the closet.
When John found out, he kicked Sheila out. The marriage lasted just 6 weeks.
At this time, Sheila had little trouble ensnaring the men that she'd set her sights on.
For many years, Sheila had a very curvy body, and she was very beautiful and was really able to maximize her sex appeal to get what she wanted.
Pretty soon after her first marriage ended, Sheila Bailey had claimed a second husband. It was to be another brief, unhappy marriage.
Sheila's second husband was a guy by the name of Ronnie Jennings. He worked at a restaurant in town, and Sheila fell hard for him. She basically wants to be loved. She wants to have a normal life. She thinks that Ronnie can provide that.
Sheila becomes Sheila Bailey Jennings. Friends of the happy couple might have thought that the stage was set for a long, happy marriage. Perhaps the bride could at last leave behind her traumatic childhood and her short-lived first marriage, settle down for good. It wasn't to be. The union between Sheila and Ronnie was soon to disintegrate, giving way to violence and infidelity.
Trauma in early life can have an impact later on, and it seems like Sheila was starting to abuse the people around her in the same ways that she had been abused herself.
She takes out her frustrations on Ronnie. She's abusive to him. And he decides that he doesn't want to be in the relationship anymore.
She took pills, sped off, and got into a pretty bad car accident. It looked like she was trying to kill herself.
Sheila survived the suicide attempt, but for a while was very unwell, comatose in fact. When she came round, she had an extraordinary tale to tell.
When she came back, she told everybody that she had died and gone to heaven, and God had sent her back as an avenging angel. And this was the persona that she carried with her throughout the rest of her life, and it sort of became the basis of her rationalization to kill.
Sheila told anyone who would listen that she was indeed an avenging angel sent by God to kill paedophiles, and that she saw herself as a protector of children. Was this truly what Sheila believed, or simply an excuse to commit unspeakable acts of violence against every man who had the misfortune to cross her path? One day, a jury would be asked that very question as they considered, had she killed Kenny County? By the end of her second marriage, Sheila had committed no crimes that attracted the attention of the police. She was on no one's radar screen of investigation. In 1987, she began looking for husband number 3 and set her sights on a doctor, Wilfred Labar.
He was a widower. He lived on a horse farm in rural New Hampshire. And Sheila found a lonely hearts ad in a newspaper that Dr. Labar had set up. He was very lonely after losing his wife and wanted companionship.
She just didn't write and say what she was looking for in a man, long romantic walks on a beach. She got right down to the point. She bared her breasts. She exposed herself, sent photos of herself in very sensual positions.
Well, he fell pretty hard for her. Sheila immediately got on a plane and began dating Wilfred Labar. And she insinuated herself into his life almost immediately.
Sheila moved in with Wilfred to become the mistress of a 100-acre horse farm in idyllic rural New Hampshire. It was the stuff of dreams, a far cry from the poverty and squalor of her Alabama childhood.
Sheila was now engaged in a relationship with somebody that could very well at least be the age of her father. And as a result, she was able, and she's this beautiful woman at the time, and she's able to manipulate and control because the older man is looking at Sheila, this is one of life's bonuses. How could somebody like himself get this beautiful young woman at the time? And so she used that. That was Sheila's web. She was able to suck him in and eventually use that to her advantage.
She moved to the farm. She started to take over his chiropractic business. She became the office manager and basically ran off all of the other employees that were, who could see through her. She separated Dr. Labar from his grown kids.
The couple never married, but Sheila took his surname She became Sheila LaBar. She's known around town as something completely different.
Sheila is a beautiful woman. She immediately gets attention in town for wearing tight clothes. In fact, people around town gave her a nickname. They called her Sheila the Peeler. They were always hoping that she would maybe flash a little this or show a little bit of that. And she got that reputation because, well, she had no problem coming to the door for delivery men wearing almost nothing.
In the quiet farming community of Epping, Sheila LaBar became notorious.
Everybody in town knows that Sheila LaBar is an unusual figure and that she is both treacherous and she is seductive.
Even the local police department, who over the following years would have many encounters with Sheila LaBar, came to be wary of her provocative behavior.
When they would go to call, she would often be in very scantily dressed clothes and sometimes just drop it and bare it all to them, with everything showing. And so officers knew when you get a call at Sheila the Peeler's house, you call for backup. Make sure somebody is there.
People at first might have worried that she was a troubled woman who needed help, not censure and gossip, but Sheila LaBar appeared to be a woman who was very much in control. The sexual relationship between Sheila and Wilfred was short-lived. Within a year, she effectively had ownership of her lover's property and his business.
When Sheila sucks him in through this relationship, she convinces him to give her power of attorney, to sign over property, and he does, because he doesn't want to lose her. He perhaps maybe doesn't feel worthy to have somebody at the time as beautiful as Sheila, but she's able to use what she believes is her beauty and charm to convince him to basically sign over everything.
She ended up spending 17 years with Wilfred, but soon after she had taken over effective control of the farm and the business, she told him he was not to consider himself as her wife or partner. She would be free to live the life of a single woman. Why did Wilfred LaBar continue to let her control his life and his livelihood?
One of the questions that's hardest to answer is, why did Dr. LaBar stay with Sheila? Why did he keep her in his life when it seems like it would be so easy to just push her away? Somebody posed this question to Dr. LaBar. Why keep Sheila around? She's making you miserable. She's taking your money. And all he could say was, she's got too much on me.
She ran his chiropractic business with a heavy hand, bullying patients into paying, scaring off employees that she didn't see eye to eye with. She also abused the doctor physically. A lieutenant with Epping Police would later testify that he'd been called to the farm many times over the years that Sheila lived there. On one occasion, he was responding to a call about a domestic disturbance and arrived to find Bill with deep scratches all over his face and neck.
Basically, she worked to isolate Dr. LaBar and to take over his life and his property.
What hold did Sheila LaBar have over the men that she abused? How did she make them stay with her, stop them lashing out at her in retaliation, or even pressing charges against her?
Sheila has an interesting habit of recording her telephone calls and her conversations.
Something Kenny County's mother was to discover years later when Sheila played her recordings of conversations that she'd had with Kenny.
And it was very, very graphic. And I was dumbfounded. At that time, when I got that tape, I didn't want to see him anymore. I didn't want to talk to him. Because it was just so, it was horrible. It was horrible.
And part of a pattern of behavior. Catch a man, record him saying things which would incriminate him, and then control him.
She wanted to make sure that the people she was involved in a relationship, that she had utter, complete, 100% control, much like her father had complete control over her. So she isolated them, almost a brainwashing technique. You isolate someone and you can have vast influence over that person, so therefore she would have that ultimate control, much like a puppet master.
And all of this kept quiet down on the farm, her own world, one kept free from prying eyes. Even though they were no longer officially romantically involved, Sheila LaBar continued to control the home, the business and the money of Dr. Wilfrid LaBar. She was so confident that he wouldn't kick her out, she started to bring home men.
Wayne Ennis was a handyman. He was a migrant farm worker from Jamaica. He was doing some work at the clinic.
It wasn't all smooth sailing. In 1995, Sheila filed a report with the Epping police accusing Wayne Ennis of attacking her. She got a restraining order against Wayne, but despite that, the same year they got married.
Sheila gets married to Wayne Ennis and brings him back to the farm. And the three of them are now living on the farm together.
Sheila had kept Dr. LaBar's last name. She was living on his farm, had control over his finances, but now she wanted him gone.
Wayne is very troubled one day when Sheila approaches him and says, we need to get rid of Dr. LaBar. If he's gone, we will inherit this property. More specifically, Sheila will inherit this property. That's because Sheila has wrestled power of attorney from Dr. LaBar. So she stands to inherit anything if something befalls the doctor. And now she's intimating to Wayne Ennis that he needs to do something to hasten Dr. LaBar's death. Wayne is very troubled by this, so he goes to Dr. LaBar and tells him what Sheila is planning. And he's fearful as well for his own safety. Dr. LaBar then drove Wayne to a bus station, got him on a bus, and he got out of town, and Sheila never saw him again.
Wilfrid LaBar had voluntarily given up the running of his home and farm. Wayne Ellis had gone without reporting what she had asked him to do, so Sheila remained living on the farm, simply waiting for her next victim to come along.
James Brackett had a low IQ and his speech was slow. He was 10 years younger than Sheila and he was one of Dr. LaBar's patients, but it didn't take long for Sheila to move him onto the farm.
Sheila is, coquettish, she's manipulative, she knows how to get what she wants out of a man, but she is also cruel. And that is one of the things that she demonstrates with James Brackett. She ends up being very abusive to him. She strikes him in the face with a scrubbing brush.
It was horrific abuse, and like all of the others, he was too afraid to leave.
James Brackett stayed on the farm almost 5 years. Midway through that time, Wilfrid LaBar died.
Dr. LaBar died in 2000. Sheila told Dr. LaBar's family that just one day he'd had a heart attack and died on the kitchen floor. And she insisted that he be cremated. It wasn't until later that people thought that this was suspicious. At the time, nobody thought much about Dr. LaBar's death, that it was anything other than natural causes.
The autopsy showed that Wilfrid had died of a massive heart attack, hypertension, arterial sclerosis, and high blood pressure. Little wonder, perhaps, given the abuse that he had suffered for over 20 years at Sheila's hands. But there was no apparent crime. His death marked a turning point in Sheila's treatment of men.
When Dr. LaBar passed away, there was nobody there to keep her in check.
Sheila now owned the farm outright. She could control who came and went. There was no one to witness what she was doing, and there was no one to stop her or intervene. Her abuse of James Brackett continued and got worse.
She one time, chased him off the property and fired a shot over his head. She even chased him into a horse trailer that was in the barn, and she chased him with an axe and tried to chop her way through the trailer where he is huddled up inside. That's like a scene out of The Shining.
Sheila LaBar's life was never normal, but her behavior after Wilfrid's death was increasingly out of control. She smoked marijuana every day, sometimes took tranquilizers.
She got involved with sex chat lines, recording the conversations, and she would often force James to listen to them, to share in her sadistic and unusual fantasies. She was violent towards him on a daily basis. On one occasion, she gouged his eye, leaving him bleeding, and on another occasion, she drove a car straight at him.
Men frequently came and went to Silver Leopard Farm, as Sheila had renamed it, or at least they arrived. They came as farmhands or as Sheila's latest love interest. After a while, Sheila would tell anyone who'd listen that they'd just upped and left, that she had no idea where they'd gone. But had they? Some were never seen again. James Brackett made several attempts to leave, once even hiking through a blizzard to a local homeless shelter. Eventually, he escaped.
It wasn't until much later that he was essentially rescued from the farm by his relatives. And James Brackett considers himself lucky to be alive today.
The next young man to be ensnared by Sheila wouldn't be so lucky. He was called Michael Deloge.
Michael Deloge was a drifter. He came from Connecticut and wound up in a homeless shelter in New Hampshire.
She was able to suck those men in, almost like a spider in a spider web, bringing them into their cave where she eventually would kill them.
Michael was estranged from his ex-wife and young child. He had substance abuse problems, he was unemployed, he was desperate, alone, and vulnerable.
The prospect of staying in a homeless shelter or going with this woman to a farm where he could get a nice warm bed and a steady job and sex, well, that's a very easy decision to make.
Less than a year later, Michael disappeared. What had happened to him? His parents had become worried. What little contact they'd had dwindled to almost nothing. They were right to worry.
There were fears for Michael's safety and rumors of violence. On one occasion, she attacked him and almost severed his ear.
The neighbors describe an incident in the winter where, coming down the wooden path from the horse farm, they saw a man stumbling and bleeding from the head. It was Michael Deloge, and he just walked right past a neighbor and said one word, Sheila.
Terrified for his safety, Michael's mum, Donna, pleaded with her son to leave. Sheila was furious. What she did next would shed some light on a mystery. How she'd been able to keep beaten and abused men like Michael under her thumb for so long.
Sheila then sent Donna a video in which Michael accused Donna of allowing him to be sexually abused as a child. But in the video, his face is scratched and bruised.
Sheila has isolated Michael from his family, therefore he wouldn't be missed.
Not only is she isolating him from his family, but she's also poisoning the relationship and getting into his head until he believes it. He actually believes that he is a child molester because she has told him that so many times.
None of this was true. The men she had snared had not committed crimes, but making incriminating recordings had become part of Sheila's MO, the way she kept her victims compliant.
Sheila has an interesting habit of recording her telephone calls and her conversations. At one point, she had over 300 cassette tapes of things her on the telephone.
Was this what Wilfred Labar had meant all those years ago when he told a friend, "She has too much on me"? Either way, Wilfred had died of apparently natural causes. Another man had run as fast as he could away from the farm. Now Michael had gone. Men just didn't seem to last very long down on the farm with Sheila Labar. In 2005, Sheila Labar was alone again. She didn't like that, so she started looking for a new, younger man.
She was using telephone dating services where you would leave a message in somebody's voicemail box. And Sheila had a habit of screening the calls. And if the man sounded confident, if he sounded like he really had it all together, she would delete those messages. If the guy sounded meek, if he sounded like he might not be of high intelligence, if he sounded like it was somebody that she could manipulate, she kept those messages and contacted those guys.
Guys like Kenneth County. Kenneth was a young man looking for love, acceptance, independence. It was this longing that drew him to Sheila Labar, and within just a month of that first meeting, led him to his brutal death at the age of 24. His journey began with a need to be independent.
Kenny's mother, Carolyn, had always tried to do her best for him, and as he got older, that meant letting him go his own way and make his own decisions, even if she worried desperately about him.
He decided, well, I'm going to join the Army, I'm going to protect our country. And he said to me, can you take me down to Lowell? I'm going to sign up for the Army. And I couldn't believe he was going to do this. And I said, no, honey, you don't want to do this. And he said, no, Ma, I'm going to.
Kenny enlisted, and Carolyn prayed that at long last something would go right for her son. For a while, it seemed like his luck had changed.
I went up to a soldier, and I tapped him, and I said, do you know Kenneth County? I said, I'm looking for Kenneth County, I'm his mother. And he looked at me, he said, Ma, it's me. I didn't even recognize him. He had muscle, he was handsome, and he stood proud, and he did everything that a soldier did. I could see the life in his eyes.
But it wasn't to be. Kenny didn't graduate. It was to be the beginning of the end for his short, troubled life.
The day before his graduation, I got a phone call from Captain Pasquale saying that Kenny wasn't graduating. And the day of graduation, my son was directing traffic. And at that point, I looked in his eyes and they were dead. They were dead.
One of the most disappointing things in his life was that he couldn't graduate with his class and got drummed out of the Army. You know, it really could have changed his life for the better. Instead, he had to move back to Massachusetts and try to make a go of it.
Kenny was at his lowest ebb. He had become severely depressed. He had attempted suicide. He was at his most vulnerable. And for Sheila, he was ripe for the picking.
When Kenny spoke of his meeting with Sheila, Carolyn knew straight away something was wrong.
They met on a chat line. Come to find out, when I found out in court, it was a sex chat line.
Kenny meets Sheila at a fancy bar overlooking the ocean. And they have a few drinks, and they move from the bar to the back seat of Sheila's car, where they have sex. A few days later, Kenny goes to his roommate and says, I'm moving out. I'm moving to New Hampshire to live on this horse farm with my new girlfriend.
He was only 24, she was in her 40s, 47. She drank, she was loud. She was obnoxious. She went to his place in Wilmington, and she told the roommate that she just wanted him to come to her place for dinner and that she'd return him. So he didn't take any clothes, he didn't take anything. And once he got into the car, that was the end. He never returned.
Kenneth County's mother would never see him again. How long did it take Kenny to realize what a grievous error he had made in getting into that car? Carolyn was alarmed enough that she immediately contacted Epping police. A female officer took the call.
She sent the police to Sheila's house, and Sheila didn't like that because of the fact that I sent the police to her house for a well-being check.
When Kenny is not returning Mom's phone calls, that's a red flag. Kenny's mom has to find out what is going on. Is he okay? So she contacted the police in Epping, New Hampshire. So the patrolmen go to Sheila's farm and they knock on the door and they say, we want to talk to Kenny. And she says he can't come to the door. He's taking a bath. They insist. And so Kenny comes to the door. He's wearing a towel. He's wet. But he seems to be okay.
Kenny might have been physically fine on that first visit by police, but Sheila was livid. How dare Carolyn report her? How dare local cops challenge her on her own property? She was not going to take the intrusion lying down.
Kenny has moved to Sheila's farm, and Sheila is doing the same pattern as she had for all the other men, and that starts with cutting him off from her family.
Sheila's response to this, when Kenny had been on the farm just a couple days, was to make a shocking tape which she played on the phone for his mother.
She had him saying all these horrible things about me, that I sexually molested him when he was a baby. that I continued to do that when I went to England.
Once again, as with Michael Deloge, James Brackett and perhaps Wilfrid Labar, Sheila was using accusations of paedophilia to control her victims and isolate them from their families.
And it was very, very graphic. I think at that time it was for me to back off. Oh, definitely, because I sent the police to her house.
Carolyn was devastated, but if Sheila had hoped that she would back off, she was mistaken. Carolyn continued trying to call her son at the farm. When she couldn't get hold of him, she repeatedly contacted local police, begging them to check on him, to remove him from the farm, anything to protect him from this scheming woman. That's the way she saw it. On one occasion, local police denied outright that Sheila was dangerous.
He told me that she would take young men to her farm and they'd work the farm, and then she'd call the police department to say that they left. Well, I found that pretty bizarre, and I said, well, how do you know they left? How do you know she didn't hurt them? She could have killed them. Did she kill them? And they started laughing. He said, no, that's not Sheila's MO.
There's nothing stronger in life often than a mother's love. And because of a mother's love for her child and refusing to accept the answers that were being given to her, she pushed and pushed and pushed and stayed in touch with the police and just wasn't satisfied with the answers she was hearing.
When the police had first visited Kenny a few days after arriving at Sheila's farm, he seemed to be doing fine. But the next time he was seen in public, his mental and physical well-being had dramatically deteriorated.
Weeks later, when these officers see Kenny at the Walmart, Sheila took Kenny to Walmart and he was unable to walk through the aisles himself. She was pushing him in a wheelchair. His face was a weird color, and he had bruises and cuts and burns.
His face was all cut up. His hands were all cut up. One of them was immobile. His head was down. He was ashen in color. He was all cut up, and he was in a wheelchair, and he couldn't walk.
What had happened to Kenneth County, and what did Sheila Labar have planned for him next? Her sinister shopping list that day should perhaps have given officers who spoke to her a clue. She certainly hadn't popped in for a few groceries.
Sheila was there shopping with Kenny, and the thing that she was buying were diesel fuel cans. And she made Kenny hold these fuel cans as she shopped.
They escorted her, and they're laughing. And she told, when they asked Kenny if he was all right, his head was hanging, he was drooling, and she told him to shut the F up. At that point, the police should have taken him. They didn't. They watched her take him to the car and lift him from the wheelchair into the car.
When Epping police told Carolyn about the sighting of Kenny, she was beside herself with fear. Once again, she pleaded with them to do something to save her son.
And I said, and you let her take him, knowing that I was looking for him, seeing the way he looked. I said, you let Sheila take my son, she's gonna kill him. And he said, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. And she killed him 2 days later.
On March 23, 2006, Sheila Labar called the local police chief and told him that Kenny had left her. Over the phone, she played cops an audio recording of Kenny confessing to a long list of truly disturbing crimes.
And Sheila says, he left, and I can prove it, and I can tell you why he left. And so she plays over the telephone a tape recording that she made of Kenny. And what the officer heard was Sheila berating Kenny and getting him to confess that he was a child molester and that he had abused kids. On the tape, the officer could hear Kenny becoming weaker. And at one point, he heard Kenny vomit. And then he thought he heard Kenny faint because Sheila was saying, get up, you can't fake fainting.
Kenny was clearly really unwell when the recording was made. She claimed to have identified a dangerous pedophile and was forcing Kenny to confess to things that he'd never done.
Panic-stricken, Carolyn filed another missing persons report. But it was too late. When police the next day visited Sheila's place, they found strong evidence that Kenny hadn't simply walked away from the farm. Carolyn's worst nightmare appeared to have come true.
The detectives go back to the property and they see a fire, and it's personal items being burned, it's clothing, it's other items, but one thing that stands out to them is they believe that they see bones.
And they appeared to be human bones, specifically a toe. It was the key mistake in the timeline of the case against Sheila LaBarre.
They also found Kenny's sneakers lying around. Would he really have left barefoot?
The evidence was everywhere that something truly horrific had happened at the farm, but Sheila LaBarre showed no fear of being caught. She'd made no attempt to hide what she was doing. She berated police for daring to trespass on her land, brazenly joked about the horrifying finds that they'd made.
When asked what was burning in the barrels, she said it could be a rabbit or it could be a pedophile. When asked about a plastic bag filled with soot and debris, she laughed and said that was Kenneth.
When police returned with a warrant to search the property, they made even more horrifying finds. There was no doubt multiple acts of extreme violence had been committed.
They spray what's called LCV. It's a type of spray that it's with dark lights, and when you spray this, if it glows purple and a purple tone to it, it indicates the presence of blood, that perhaps that was blood. And when the detectives used this technique inside of Sheila's home, the whole inside, this one room, lit up purple. An indication that there was an extremely large amount of violence that took place inside that room.
Detectives also finally had an answer to the fate of Michael Deloge, who disappeared without a trace a year before.
One of the things they did was they flushed the septic tank. What they found in the septic tank when they searched it was Michael Deloge's driver's license.
But another piece of evidence unearthed at the farm remains a mystery to this day.
We don't know how many victims that are out there that Sheila actually was able to suck into her web. What still haunts the detectives is a toe, a single toe. A single toe was found on that property. That toe is unidentified.
One of the things later about the human toes was that they didn't belong to Kenny, and they didn't belong to Michael Deloge. So who is it?
Detectives now knew that terrible things had happened at the isolated horse farm in rural New Hampshire, and Carolyn County knew that her efforts to save her eldest son had been in vain.
That was my son. That was my son. Could have been stopped.
Finally, one mistake having been uncovered and other evidence now plentiful, a warrant was issued for Sheila LaBarre's arrest. But still, she thought she was above the law. From under the noses of local police, she went on the run.
Sheila took $85,000 with her and hitched a ride with a man called Steve Martello.
She wanted to hitchhike her way down to Boston. So Steve picks her up in his car, and after having some breakfast together, they continue down to Boston. And she gets a hotel room with him, and the two of them have sex, and then he leaves. And it isn't until he sees the news that Sheila is a wanted woman that he realizes who he had picked up.
She seduced him, and he let her hole up in his apartment for a couple days.
He realizes who he has let into his home, and he calls the police and essentially sets up her capture.
Sheila LaBarre was behind bars at last. When the case went to trial, Sheila finally admitted killing Kenneth County and Michael Deloge, but asked for clemency on the grounds of insanity.
She changed her story several times about how her victims had died. She kept going back again and again to that same story that she was an avenging angel sent to kill pedophiles, and that all of the men in her life were child molesters.
The jury rejected Sheila's plea. There was too much evidence of calculation, control, manipulation, not only of her victims, but of everybody that she came into contact with.
And the burden is on the defense, in this case Sheila, that they didn't know what they did was wrong. Why this story would unravel with Sheila is because of the amount of planning that went into her murders and the cover-up. Somebody who's crazy isn't going to try to burn evidence. Somebody who's crazy isn't going to try to cover up the amount of blood that was inside the house. Somebody who is crazy isn't going to methodically pick the most vulnerable of victims.
Sheila LaBarre is a disturbed person, but she knew what she was doing when she killed those men and when she hid the evidence.
Michael Deloge's mother was in court to see LaBarre found guilty, sentenced to 2 life tariffs without parole. Caroline County was there too, the mother who never gave up. She wasn't able to save her son, but she did ensure that his killer was brought to justice for her evil crimes.
I promised Kenny that I'd fight for him, because nobody did. That he wouldn't be forgotten. When Sheila murdered him, she burnt everything in the pit. I never had a body. I never had closure. I never had anything. So he could walk through that door now, and I'd be expecting him. And I promised him his name would not be in vain. She wasn't used to being confronted by anybody. Sheila had the run of Epping. What Sheila said went. She'd be able to say anything to the police. They didn't want to deal with her, so they just backed down.
Sheila thought that she was invincible. She thought that she could do what she wanted and get away with it, and she never thought that anyone would have the guts to confront her.
Sheila LaBarre was so brash that she didn't cover her tracks, as she left a human bone sticking out of a burning barrel in her yard. It gave the police the opportunity they'd been waiting for to finally investigate her crimes. That was the mistake made by a killer, Sheila LaBarre.